is based on complexity, and so everything can fall apart. Nothing is simple, and everything is built out of complex parts, form and matter, and corruption and generation. And this is this is from the moon on down, by the way, the moon and the sublunary world of the Earth. And then below that, you simply have matter, which is the chaos that things revert back to when they disintegrate and form and matter pull apart. And so that's the kind of great chain of being that is the essence of the Neoplatonist philosophy. And what the Renaissance artists did, Michelangelo in particular, as well as Botticelli and Leonardo, is they inherited this philosophy, and the whole myth is that the soul has descended through these levels and taken on these qualities, and once it has become incarnate on the earth, it has become enwrapped in increasingly dense layers of matter, so that it forgets the Platonic wisdom and knowledge of the spheres, the mathematics, geometry, the archetypal forms, the planets, and it forgets all of that. It forgets its divine origins. So it finds itself in a body, and the whole goal of education is to reconnect the mind back to the divine origins in the heavens through the cultivation of reason. And it is the imposition of reason on the desires of the body that begin to liberate the mind and the soul from the body. And that's the Neoplatonic, that's the core of the philosophy there. And when you look now at Michelangelo's works with this in mind, you see a whole different world. The dying slaves that Michelangelo carved are not dying slaves, nor were they represented as such. They're presented that way by art historians who know nothing about philosophy. The dying slaves are Michelangelo's deliberate personification of the soul trapped in the body. The slaves are bound because the soul is bound by the body. And the one slave that is beginning to wake up and liberate itself with the arms stretching up is the soul beginning through the cultivation of reason by studying the Platonic writings and texts, beginning to awaken and divorce itself from pure animal appetites. And so you have all through these Renaissance images, every one of the paintings and the sculptures are allegories of this Neoplatonic philosophy of the soul freeing itself from its merely animal nature. Botticelli's painting of the centaur, for example, and Minerva, the goddess of wisdom. And he's sort of the man sunken into his animal nature, and she is wisdom that liberates him up out of it. I mean, every one of these paintings is a translation into images of philosophical concepts. And this is why Hillman likes the Renaissance, because his agenda, remember, is the translation of scientific concepts back into their archetypal images. And here's the key for it, is in the Renaissance. This back and forth translation of concepts into images enables you to see how concepts can conceal archetypes within them. So Hillman's central endeavor in revisioning psychology is to find the gods in our illnesses, in our thoughts, in our emotions. And so that's personifying. That's what he means by personifying. You're personifying your illness when you think of depression in connection with Saturn. It's a Saturnian thing. That's a personification. And by doing that, you are sort of deliteralizing the illness. And he says this will also free up the kind of sterile, empty diagnostic labels that psychoanalysts like to pin on their patients when they come in, and they sort of don't have any other identity other than, I'm an alcoholic or I'm schizophrenic. And that becomes their label, and they sort of live in accordance with that label. Well, Hillman says the way in which we deliteralize that is by seeing through, getting rid of those diagnostic labels, and seeing through to the archetypes, the gods that are involved in the illnesses. The alcoholic has a problem with the Neptunian archetype, or depression with Saturn, and so on. And by doing that, you are imaginatively seeing through the illness to the fantasy that the soul is having. Every pathology, everything that is going on that is wrong with us isn't something wrong. It's the soul fantasying, imagining itself, personifying itself through you. And you, by paying attention to what the gods are in the illnesses, are giving them their due. And that's all they're asking for. So in the chapter on pathologizing, then, he goes through and he discusses what gods you can find in what particular illnesses. Saturn and depression, he says Dionysus is the god in hysteria, the sort of hysterical, the association of Dionysus with women. All the Bacchants who followed Dionysus were all hysterical women who would go around tearing animals apart. That kind of thing, that is in the hysterical neurosis. And he says Pan, the epiphallic god with the erection, is the god of masturbation, rape, panic. That is the god in that illness that is communicating to you. Cupid and Psyche discusses as the central myth of erotic entanglements. Hercules is the sort of ego myth figure, and so on. So he goes through and shows you what the gods are in the illnesses, and this deliteralizes the illness and turns it into soul-making fantasy. And he says this is all, that there is no, he gets rid of the whole idea of the individuation process. He says there is no goal here. There's nothing that it has these sequences and stages that you specifically have to go through that is seeking toward an end. That's not the case at all. Any more than your dreams just sort of randomly begin and end. They're just fantasies. And so too with what is going on with you, the soul is trying to make itself, that is creating an imaginal vessel, a kind of ship of death, that is trying to create a center of consciousness that is different from your ego consciousness and preparing for your death, so that when you leave the world, the ship of death will be woven out of these fantasies and images. He says this is his theory of dreaming, for example. He says dreams are the descent into the underworld, and there you encounter the shades, the twittering ghosts and figures of your imagination that are becoming part of your personal underworld mythology, and your soul that is weaving together its ship of death that will disengage you from the body and carry you off into the afterlife. Does he mean all of this literally? No, because his whole point is personifying. We're thinking imaginally. We're thinking in terms of metaphors. We're not literalizing the gods. He says the gods are not literal things that we worship. They are imaginal possibilities, imaginal attitudes, ways of looking at the world imaginatively. And so that's the sort of idea in pathologizing. In psychologizing, he shifts now from the sphere of pathology, neurosis, psychosis, and all of that, to the sphere of the intellect. And he begins looking in terms of what are the gods and the ideas of philosophers, the gods in science. He says any explanation can be seen through as a myth, no matter what it is. Any idea can be seen through as a myth. He says Apollo, for example, is the reigning archetype of science. The scientific endeavor has been, you recall, one of masculine objectivity, clarity, sort of distance from the object, and this is precisely what Apollo, the sun god, is the god of clear, radiant thought. He goes chasing after the women, but the women want nothing to do with him, whereas the women that Zeus goes after will receive him, and so forth. There's this kind of sunlight, masculine, rationalistic consciousness there. And he says Zeus, for example, is the god of philosophy. Zeus is the eagle who is obsessed with law, as philosophers usually are, the laws, and has this sort of all-encompassing vision. He sails forth as an eagle and mates with all of these nymphs and so forth, and that is the sort of philosophical vision. And then he goes through and he looks at things like, he says, there are different ideas of the soul, and when we look at different ideas of the soul, we can see through them. Psychologizing means seeing through. You are deliteralizing the image, seeing through it, so that it becomes transparent to the indwelling myth. And he says that the image that we are seeing through there in the soul, for example, you take the Jungian idea of the soul is growing and developing over time, the individuation process. He says anytime we postulate this idea, this model, this growth model of the soul, we're invoking the Great Mother and her dying and reviving Son, the archetype of growth. He says even in science, the evolutionary theory that things have evolved and grown over time conceals an invocation of the Great Mother archetype, the mother of nature and the vegetation and things that grow out of her, and her dying and reviving Son, who's a personification of the vegetal processes of nature. And that's another example. And then he says, look at the Christian idea of the soul standing in love. As far as Augustine is concerned, the soul cannot do anything but love. It is loved by God. It is in love. He says this is an activation of the archetype of Aphrodite. Or he says the old philosophical theory that the soul is a tabula rasa, which is exactly the opposite of the whole Neoplatonic tradition, where the soul is just a blank slate. And everything that we learn comes into us through the gates of our senses and is imprinted upon us, is essentially a shallow theory of education. But he says this is essentially the idea of Cinderella, who is incapable, or Sleeping Beauty, who is incapable of awakening herself except by something that comes to her externally. So he just goes through and he pulls through these ideas the archetypes that are in them, and in doing so, he's sort of transubstantiating psychology so that it becomes radiant to the imagination. So he says, as a result of this, archetypal psychology can psychologize anything in society. We are now moving out of the consulting room We're moving analysis out of the consulting room